So it'll be just like an open conversation that Olu then cuts up and turns into a podcast
Okay.
episode.
All right. Olu. So Olu's going to make me sound good. Okay. Thanks, Olu. All right.
Well, he's yet
Don't
to
let
do
me
it for
down,
me,
man.
so
Don't let me
he's yet
down.
to do it for me.
You're listening to the Offsite Podcast with Jason and Carlos, where we talk all things construction and technology.
Join us for discussions with industry leaders and insights into the latest trends in construction.
Welcome back to the podcast. Before we dive in, Carlos, mate, how are you?
Yeah, all good, thank you. Currently in a chaotic flat where my wife's trying to pack for our first holiday with the 2-month-old.
Okay,
we used to share one suitcase. Yeah, we used to share one suitcase, and now I've got 3. So yeah, I'll let you know how the flight goes tomorrow.
Very good. In the UK, have you got, is it new Prime Minister yet, or what's the story on the election? Done and dusted? Might as well hold it now.
We have a new Prime Minister. It's a formality now. The Tories have absolutely tanked it. Labour are super strong. So yeah, we just have to wait for it to happen now.
The obvious question as like a construction software vendor then is like, is that good for construction or bad for construction?
I think it's actually good. There's going to be a huge amount of investment or additional investment in renewables. I wouldn't be surprised if the other half of HS2 suddenly popped up again, because Labour seem to be more invested in the Northern Powerhouse project. So to make that connection would make a lot of sense. So yeah,
there's nothing like starting a project, stopping a project, and restarting a project to make sure you get value for money for it.
Yeah. Let's redesign it 3 times. But as long as you redesign it to a cheaper scope, it's fine, right?
Yeah, it's like that classic meme where it's like what the client wanted, what the designer designed. You get this like eventually this tree with like no swing on it.
Yeah,
look it up.
Yeah.
It's a meme about a tree with a swing. A topic today that we wanted to dive into is something that came up in a series of conversations over a couple of weeks when we were talking about every construction software company and every like article or post on LinkedIn that talks about the construction industry has this like one chart from McKinsey that talks about productivity in construction. And it's like, there's the like productivity growth of every other industry, and there's construction just like basically flat for 20 years. And if you can't do a slide on construction, and you can't make a pitch deck about construction that doesn't have that slide in it, it's like an obligatory slide. We're talking about like what is productivity, and it's basically the output per like hour worked from a worker on a construction site. For my dumb brain, that's like super tactically, you could basically visualize that as this idea of keeping resources that are on site busy, producing actual valuable work. And on the flip side of that, so many of the conversations that we have in the space of scheduling, in planning, in production on a construction site often get drawn into this, like, we've got to get this work done because the master schedule says, and that's what the critical path of the project is. And it's almost like the flip side of the coin to the concept of productivity, which would be like more around like flow of work and keeping resources busy. And so I wanted to have this conversation in depth around like, is there a balance to be had between the two? What's different between the two? How do projects balance those things? And we've got the perfect guest to have the conversation with. Welcoming to the podcast, Richard Fifita. Richard is the CEO of Veyor, which is resource scheduling platform, well, based out of the greatest country in the world, in Oz, and doing awesome things with construction contractors. Richard, thanks for joining us, mate.
Yeah, great to be here, mate. Thanks for having me on. I
do this obligatory like stalk your people's LinkedIn in preparation for the podcast, and I knew we'd get on when I saw you. We both worked at John Holland, and we both went to the UK, and then we both came back from the UK and then started working in software. There's something about going to the UK that says, I don't want to keep working in construction, maybe.
Yeah, and also something about it where you say, oh, hey, there's a lot of problems in this industry. We need to go back home and fix the industry, right?
We had this idea of like, we were in Oz working on a project going, there must be a better way. Moved to the UK, got over there, go, that isn't better. Let's go come home and...
Yeah, as I was saying before, like I've been on construction sites out in Dubai, in America, and it's just you see all the same things, the same processes, the same like permit boards, whiteboards for like, planning deliveries and cranes, and
Hmm.
it's pretty nuts like how similar everything is irrespective of where you go. Yeah, the UK and Australia was actually not too far off each other, I'd say, in terms of standards. Did you find the same?
Yeah, I think the what's super interesting in with that like similarity across so many markets is how different even two companies' processes are, or like feels they are.
Interestingly, my the construction project that I was running was in Vauxhall, and it was actually right on the River Thames. It was called
Is it Thames
the
Tideway?
Corniche. It was called the Corniche. It was actually a high-rise apartments. It was called the
The
Corniche.
flashy ones. It's like a nice
Yeah, the
circular
curvy
shape.
ones.
Yeah,
Yeah,
nice.
correct. Yeah, so I did the earthworks, like the ground foundations and the structure for it. It was actually pretty interesting, like engineering wise, because you were digging a basement right adjacent to a train line structure. So there was just so much temporary works and monitoring needed and etc. But what was even more interesting was catching the train into work early in the morning on a Monday, and so you'd walk past, there'd be like nightclubs, people still queuing up at 7:30 in the morning
Yeah,
on a Monday to go into the nightclubs. So you were just walking past all these like interesting characters every Monday morning.
Yeah, yeah.
And then suddenly you got the River Thames and Westminster across the river and everything. So it was definitely an interesting area. It seems to be changing quite a lot now, but that was a interesting memory.
Coming from Australia is wild with how late everything starts in the UK and people get up. Like you get up at like 5:30 in the
Yeah.
morning, and it feels like you're
Yeah.
walking around a ghost town for 4 hours, with no one anywhere.
Yeah, there was definitely like a different expectations on like hours. So I was kind of everyone just thought I was mad that I'd still be in the office at 6 some days just because I was like, oh no, I just haven't finished what I was planning to do. And they're like, all right,
Yeah.
weirdo. Um, but yeah, I think it's probably just an Australian culture, which I don't know if it's the best way to go about it. I think there's definitely shifts in the way Australian construction sites are now operating, and you're trying to move more towards the 5 day work week and everything. But
Yeah, yeah.
that's a whole other topic.
Well, right, I'll pull us back onto topic, and so
Yeah,
I guess I'll pick up from where we were. And so, Richard, like with I guess most of the audience that would typically listen to this podcast being across Oz, UK, and the typical audience being construction managers, project managers, and planners. For anyone that hasn't seen or heard or used Veyor, do you want to give like let's say the 2 minute
yep.
overview of how of what it does and how you support projects?
Yeah, definitely. So we're I guess a delivery and material scheduling tool. What that means is that, oh, sorry, the process that we replace is the way engineers, subcontractors, and suppliers all schedule their deliveries and materials coming in and out of their sites. So a lot of the time, it's just lots of phone calls, lots of emails and spreadsheets. And then there's a coordination process at the end of each day where they're looking at what are you prioritizing to enable those deliveries. So in a high-rise construction site, for example, you need the tower crane to be lifting the material up the tower. And normally I'll have a meeting in front of a whiteboard where everyone is shouting out their requests, saying, oh, I need 7 a.m., I need 8 a.m. But there's
Mm-hmm.
always, everyone always wants 7 a.m. So what our system does is that we allow that process to happen by a digital booking form where people can see what times haven't been requested yet for the tower cranes, or is the delivery zone free as well so I can get my trucks in, or you might realize there's a concrete pour booked out so the crane can't actually receive any deliveries for the day, so it can only do work the internal lifts. So our system helps you schedule and plan all of those different moving parts with your supply chain, as well as all your internal crane movements or logistical movements. And so it's a very much a coordination and planning tool. But at the same time, it's about tracking what's arrived on that material. What have you got through? How many, tons of steel reinforcement has arrived so far? How many cubes of concrete have you received so far? So the logistics, the deliveries, and the material, it's all interlinked, obviously. So our system helps you order, plan, and coordinate all of that with your supply chain.
So going back to this, the thing that I kind of started out with, which is this like productivity piece, being getting the most output for an hour of work or an hour of a piece of equipment. How much of what customers are doing in that workflow that you described is about like utilization of the piece of equipment or the loading, and how much of it is literally, I need to get steel over here and there's a concrete pour and the crane can't lift? How much of it is like a logistical collaboration thing, and how much of it is like an efficiency and productivity piece?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one is the logistical coordination is more in the lead up to the work, and then the utilization tracking is once the work is happening. And so on one level, just being able to plan all that work stops unexpected arrivals turning up. A lot of the time, when you don't have a clear planning process, a lot of people will just turn up at the gate and try to squeeze in a delivery and say, "Oh, can you just squeeze in one lift?" And that at a high level sounds like not a big deal, but it all just has that follow-on effect where the whole schedule starts pushing out. And in high-rise construction in particular, a lot of the material is coming in on a just-in-time basis. There's always workers waiting for that material to start being worked on. So steel reinforcement, for example, is probably the best example of that. The steel fixers are all waiting there. There's only so much you can load up at a time. They'll lift up the bottom steel and drop that in. They start installing that straight away, but then all the top steel will then come at midday. But if that midday delivery is running late because it's been held up on another job, the workers can't do anything on site. And so to your question about utilization, typically people don't know where that next delivery is coming. People are just standing around waiting for it at the gate. But what our system does is, we give that visibility. If a truck's turning up, like coming late, the steel supplier can provide that information. You can see, is somebody else ready to take that request or to use that waiting time, and then you can, I guess, shuffle the schedule in real time and let other people come in earlier. So these cranes are so very expensive equipment. You've got several crane riggers and drivers who are usually being contracted out for over $100 per hour. And then in Australia, anytime after 3 o'clock, they're being charged at about double time to the GC. So you've got this very expensive labor force. And if they're ever standing around doing nothing, it just means that the work that they're supposed to be doing is going to be getting done at the end of the day when it's even more expensive to do.
Yeah.
So, and I guess one of the other things that we find is that when you have repeat offenders, when you're able to start recording who keeps coming in late, who keeps taking longer than they should, you're able to record all these non-compliances because there's a direct cost to people standing around doing nothing for an hour. So you start to, get all that compliance information, like know the poor performers are and so forth.
Yeah, I'm immediately having flashbacks to different projects, mate, where I'm thinking about, the afternoon before having the conversation where a bunch of supervisors are saying, I need to lift the, infrastructure job, the bridge girder at 10 o'clock, it's arriving. Then someone else is saying, but can you unload a rebar truck for me, 8 o'clock that morning? Rebar truck turns up late. Then you're screwed on the girder lift, and then things just kind of back up through the day, and then the thing at the end doesn't happen. The immediate thoughts obviously were like around crane lifts and scheduling crane lifts. Does that pattern of like logistics and coordination and scheduling happen at any other parts of the construction process, or is it largely like crane based?
Well, with high rise construction, like one of the sayings an old site manager said to me was like, he's basically, look, Rich, the crane is the heart of the job. Like, if your crane's not doing anything, your site's not doing anything. And I used to have a construction director who would sit by the window because our site office was in a high rise opposite our site, and he'd just sit there watching the cranes. And I remember this one time I saw the crane's not doing anything, and I rang my crane coordinator's like, mate, why's the crane not doing anything? Get it going. Just start looking busy. Go lift things on the other side of the site so it looks like you're doing work. And
Look
like,
busy.
because again, yeah. And like, I mean, look, there's nothing worse than like if an operations manager or a construction manager walks past the site and the cranes aren't doing anything, because it just means like they'll start telling you that you don't need the crane, or they're going to threaten to take the cranes off you. So it just means like for them, you're not planning properly, you're not getting enough work done. So it's a really bad look in high-rise construction. But to your question on what other plants and equipment would, I guess, indicates progress. Interestingly, the crane is all about how do you get the vertical movement of material up and down efficiently. But the other tools for doing that is also your hoists, goods lifts. We typically find that once the tail cranes get removed, everything starts going up the hoists and the goods lift, and you need to have like a clear structure for organizing all of that. And so we're normally used right through to the end of the project, and then your loading dock becomes a bottleneck. So it's about how efficiently you can feed deliveries and material into the loading dock and then up the goods lift. So it's the same concept around efficient vertical movement. And so you find that the means of moving your material up and through the tower changes throughout the course of the project. Or as my old site manager used to say, like, yeah, it's all like high rise is all about how efficiently you feed the job. The more efficiently you can get the materials being fed through, the better chance you have of meeting all your program requirements.
There's obviously this huge coordination piece ultimately. There's obviously a lot of pre-planning that can go into the theory of what is tomorrow and how we're going to sort of schedule everything in. We're dealing with some of the most volatile aspects of construction, which is deliveries. It could be late, cranes that could be winded off, etc., etc. Who's the ultimate sort of conductor? And by that, I mean, if things are being delayed, is the person in charge just trying to get their day job done, or are they thinking what's most critical? How do we sort of sequence this in the way that's actually best for the project, not just to get the task list complete, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a good question. And like that kind of just indicates like how you're right. It is a volatile space because the elements are constantly changing as well, which just complicates things further. But it is typically your site manager or general superintendent who will make that call, because their job is to make those tough calls on who gets prioritized over other people. If you've been winded off and now the cranes are operational only for 2 hours at the back end of the day, everyone's going to be screaming at the site manager saying, hey, my lift is more priority than theirs. So you do really need someone that's quite strong-headed enough to tell everybody else to piss off, but at the same time understands what's really driving the program. What are the critical lifts that's going to help drive critical path? So it always goes back to critical path and program. And I always find the best site managers that I've dealt with understand that. They understand what's not important and what is important. And they'll always make those calls, and they'll push back on everybody else. So I guess that's why they get paid the big bucks, because they are tough decisions and everyone's calling you and screaming at you saying that they're more important than the other people. But the general superintendent or the site manager on a building site would be that person.
And whilst this is all kicking off, how's everyone in the loop? Like, is it actually individual phone calls? Do you have radios that everyone's sort of listening in?
Yeah, it's a disaster because like I had to do this when I was I thought it was the biggest stitch up at the time. Like I got tasked with being a logistics manager on a big high-rise project. God, like whenever like the cranes got winded off, or if the crane broke down in the morning, my phone would be just going off. Everyone trying to call me to ask, oh, what's happening with my delivery? Like my truck's waiting around the corner. Do I send it off? Do I keep it? And then I would always then go through the priorities with my site manager about which ones are we going to keep, which ones we bump to tomorrow, and then which deliveries from the next day do we bump to the next day, etc. So I guess that's what makes it so difficult, is that you're constantly reprioritizing, but then the other complexity when you're dealing with like a manual system is that you then need to call every single person, and then they normally say back to you, oh, actually I can't do that, I can't do this other time, but then that conflicts with something else. And so it's this really crazy process of back and forth phone calls and trying to make
Sounds
a
like
schedule
sounds
work.
like trying to organize going to the pub with 4 mates, and then you have to be the
Yes.
person that calls that person, and then
Yeah,
and
trying
then
to
no, I
organize it.
can't.
Yeah, with 4 people with kids, that's what it's like.
Yeah,
Because then
that's it.
they check their kids' schedule and then they've, oh no, actually, Amy has a kids' party on that day. Can you try this day? And then it's like
100%.
it's crazy. So yeah,
You
it's a
you
chaotic
said
process.
you said something before which is really interesting. The idea that like the best person to make these calls on priorities is someone that's got this understanding of like I guess the project schedule, what's critical. The flip side of that is something that we see like a lot from the like planning side is that there'll be almost the total opposite, which is if you look at the project through this like master schedule, you end up seeing some projects go down this path of really like hyper prioritizing critical path to the massive
Mm.
detriment of non-critical work. And
Yep.
then the result of that is you just push off all this work that's supposed to be getting done and sacrifice it for the critical path work. And then you end up
Yep.
this kind of like big bunch of work getting pushed further and further out, and you end up with like this kind of bow wave effect where eventually that just comes to the head and the schedule blows out massively. Like on one extreme on the schedule world, you've got this hyper focus on critical path. On what we were talking about before, there's this idea of every day we're trying to get the most work done. And so there's like a prioritization of the stuff that is critical. From a product perspective, can you do anything around making people aware of like what is priority or more higher priority in the like coordination of those things, or does it have to live in someone's mind?
At the moment, it does live in someone's mind, but I think if anything, the utilization data around who is the primary user of the crane, what are the primary deliveries coming in and out of the job, actually paints that picture that
Mm-hmm.
you're prioritizing too much towards structure. And so, like, it's funny, we've got these cool dashboards where you actually see the usage by the trade. Like there's like a histogram, and at the start, it's basically all structure, but then the structure starts to go down, and facade starts to come in, then fit out trades start to
Mm-hmm.
come in. And then before you know it, the structure's topped out, and then it's predominantly facade. These are the kind of, I guess, patterns and trends that people look out for. So if anything, our system maybe highlight through the utilization data that you're prioritizing one company too much over another. And like to your example there, in the what would happen in construction if that were the case is that you'll end up having like this massive empty car park with like no facade on it if you just keep prioritizing the
Yeah.
structure, right? If a high-rise site is being built in a good way, what normally would be happening is you'll have the top 3 floors as structure, then below it should be 3 floors dedicated to the curtain wall facade installation that's happening around the perimeter. The next 3 floors below that will be maybe, services, trades, and so forth, and then fit out trades below. So the general pattern with like efficient high-rise construction is that you have all these trades following each other up the tower in a cyclical fashion.
Mm-hmm.
And that becomes evident. Like, it's cool. We see the trends on our dashboards that, like, it's almost like, yes, you've now reached floor 7, where the facade deliveries of the facade started ramping up. And if you don't see it, you can start asking questions. Are there issues with the fabrication?
Yeah.
Are the facades not arrived on time? So it can help you detect those issues. But what we are finding, or what a lot of people have said, is that a lot of the old timers, like the OGs of construction, who know all this stuff inside out around the cycles and how
Mm-hmm.
nicely everything should be behind each other, like they're all retiring. And then there seems to be this sort of big gap between the next generation coming through. And I think
Yeah.
that is where systems like ours need to try to capture this type of data to teach the next generation, because it's all stuff that just gets passed down by word of mouth from one super to another and so forth. And
So
if we can better capture that data, it'll
yeah,
hopefully
yeah.
help the next guys.
And if I'm like thinking on the spot of like the things that you would want to measure from that, and you can tell me whether that's like what people would be measuring. I'd imagine if I'm like if I'm running the facade team, or if I'm a sub that's trying to complete a scope on the build, there's probably this interesting measure of like how often you're pushing my requested time. So is that like part of the mechanic? Like I'm asking for 7 and repeatedly you're giving it to me at 1 p.m. sort of thing. Is that a thing that people are measuring? Is that
Not
it?
so. I wouldn't say they're measuring. So measuring it in what respect? Like,
Well, just like I could imagine this, this metric where if I could visualize this dashboard of each of the different teams that might be requesting, and the effective kind of like a push rate of like, yeah, how often or how close on average is my requested time to the time I actually get.
yeah. Interestingly, it's probably more around the quantum of time provided as opposed to the exact
Yeah,
time.
right.
Like and interestingly, you start to see patterns form where people start allocating between 7 to 10 is all structured trades are prioritized. Between 10 to 12, we'll do the first load of facade deliveries, and then between 3 to 5, we'll do the second load of facade deliveries, and everyone else is like sort of falling in between. So you see these patterns form on sites where it doesn't happen organically. It's more like dictated by the site managers. Like we sort of see all these trends where site managers are saying, I always prioritize structure at the start of the day, then next is the facade, then the next can be all
Yeah,
the
right.
finishes and services trades. But what we do is like we start seeing the total quantum of time that people are requesting, whether they're generally putting in 3 hours of requests per day and then what's active and approved and done. You can record the actuals of how long the crane has been allocated to specific trades. And
do you tie that to like how long it's actually used? Do you record the actual?
Yeah, correct. It's a manual input, however, so it's either the crane operator or the main crane rigger recording. Yet we started at this time and we finished at this time, so it's not super exact, but it's indicative that that work did happen. And interestingly, some of the structural steel companies actually start inserting into their contracts that they have a minimum number of hours of craneage required each week. And so our utilization tracking becomes a way to sort of verify that these contractual terms are being met. Again, like I guess that highlights how critical craneage is on a lot of these types of projects. And so if there's a shared tower crane, people are now just starting to make it mandatory or putting it into their contracts that they have to have X hours of craneage a week, or they have reason to put in an extension of time claim.
And then for folks that are thinking about this, for me thinking about this problem, I start to think about in like different directions. How far does what's the like box that you draw around the product? And so I'd imagine it goes like out to delivery coordination, delivery times. There's like a notification or some interaction with the drivers of vehicles. So that touches like the suppliers. And then there's like vehicle management plans related to that. Does that kind of come into the picture?
Yeah, that's more of our infrastructure customers. That's more of a feature that they utilize more. So we have like a site maps feature where the admins can update the latest VMPs. So we have a broadcast that we can then issue out to notify everybody, the access routes have changed today, or this gate will be closed as of tomorrow, etc. So from a logistics perspective, communicating all the routes is also a big problem, especially if routes change from time to time. So that's another logistical challenge. Is like, when I said earlier that it's all about how efficiently you feed the job, but then if you keep changing the feeding entry points, that's going to create challenges, right? So, and then also if the way you enter those access points has specific requirements, again, that further, if a new access point only, goes through a bridge of a certain head height limit, that's the kind of critical information that needs to be relayed across to people. So,
the extent of effort, and I'm reflecting on a project that Carlos and I worked on Crossrail years ago. The amount of effort and manual coordination with vehicle travel routes, scheduling, staging of the vehicles, communicating and understanding where the drivers were at. There are whole teams of people just doing that. And I'd imagine that's a massive set of it's a massive value add for infrastructure projects, the like staging, the tracking of the vehicles, the traffic management plans. Carlos, that's something that you see. I know there's like an incumbent product in the UK. Does that sound like a similar scope of related things?
Yeah, do you know, as soon as you said that, I remember going on site on Crossrail, and you'd go on and it wouldn't match the logistics plan that you had. And when you asked, they'd be like, why weren't you in your suit here at 7 a.m. for the briefing when we actually went through the plan for today and you're not looking at something else? Yeah, so logistics planning is quite a big one because particularly with the London jobs, it's so congested that they have to, they literally replan logistically every day. So it's not like a pedestrian like walkway or a material handling area that's there for a week or a month. It seems to be changing every 24 hours.
Yeah.
And there's not really any good tools that are like managing that well, communicating it well, and making sure that everyone is in the loop to make it as efficient as possible.
Yeah, it's been more of our infrastructure customers that have been pushing that, and so which is why we started heading down towards that, because it was what I was saying before about high-rise construction in general is being dynamic. It's the access routes is just dynamic, and how efficiently you communicate that with everybody is quite a crucial component of the productivity on these infrastructure jobs.
Yeah, for sure. If we think about performance, you mentioned that you track, like we can track how much a crane was utilized over a shift. We can track like how late deliveries were. How much of this information, and I'd assume probably more than that information, goes back into like refining or improving the logistics strategy of a project? Or is it very much like gut feel, this isn't going too well at the moment, so let's try something else tomorrow?
No, it's a good point. No, it's I would say the corrections are based on gut feel by the approver, the logistics manager or whoever it is. So for example, an engineer might be bringing in 20 ton of the steel reinforcement going to the top of the tower, and he might have put in a booking request for an hour. But then, someone like a crane rigger or a logistics manager should be able to look at that booking request, see that it's 20 tons, and there's a bin full of steel bundles and so forth, and they can work out actually there's 6 lifts here. They're going to take about 20 minutes each. I'm going to extend that to about an extra half an hour or an extra hour. So just through those adjustments that they make, really what ends up happening is that the people requesting starts to learn that, actually, that's how much I need to be requesting. That's typically how long it takes to complete that task. And so it's almost like you're passively learning off it. We should actually be trying to capture that data in a better way, like to say, 20 tons going up 20 floors should actually take you longer than that. We just haven't had a chance to get into making all these smart suggestions. That makes sense. But there's definitely lots of that data is actually helping people better understand, and then everybody also seeing what everyone else is requesting. What's been really cool, and I didn't expect when we created the product at first, was that everyone actually starts holding each other accountable. People will see that they're booked in for 9 o'clock. If someone else comes in and tries to squeeze in, they go up to them with the app and say, "Look, you're not, I'm the next one in. You're not approved," etc. And so what we find is that subcontractors start holding each other accountable and saying, "Look, you better get there early because I don't want you to push my time out for my delivery." There's a shared responsibility.
Exactly. There's that accountability of we're making commitments in front of each other and to each other that this is when we're going to do this, and no one wants to be the one that lets the team down. I think that visibility and accountability is super important concept that I think would be making a big impact.
Yeah, definitely. And interestingly, it seems to be something that they do more in America. You guys are probably actually up your alley, but the whole last planner,
Mhm.
like, because we're more in the now that we're on a lot more sites in the US and we go out to different site offices, we see those big ass whiteboards and post-it notes, and I just like the fact that they actually get around each other and say, yes, you're basically committing to each other that you'll finish that task by that day so the next
Yeah.
person can come in. And it's in a nice, simple format. You know, when you get to that stage, you can give each other shit if someone hasn't, or like they'll make a bit more of an effort because, you know, it's a different thing when someone just dumped a Gantt chart on you. Yeah, that transparency and everyone being able to see what everyone's planning and knowing who's going to impact who actually creates a much more collaborative work site. And then people start coordinating and having these conversations prior to these meetings where they come up with an agreement. And interestingly, we saw that on our system. We would sometimes see like an overlapping booking, and then I'd click in on the overlapping booking, and that subby had put in a comment and said, "Oh, yep, I spoke with the other trade, and we've
Mhm.
agreed to share the loading zone, and I'm bringing in a smaller truck." So
Yeah,
that
perfect.
whole
Yeah.
coordination is pretty awesome.
It's like the saying that his old superintendent used to say is if you want people to play like a team, give them a scoreboard. And so yeah, there's that like shared buy-in.
Yeah,
We're
like that.
we're accountable for it. So, mate, I'm conscious of time. I think
All good.
we'll wrap it up there. And I want to thank you,
Yeah,
mate,
cool.
for taking the time. It was a super enjoyable
No worries.
conversation. Carlos, thank you. Richard, thank you. And yeah, we'll see you all next week.
Thanks, Richard.